Hello and welcome everyone. This is Taco Movie Talks. I am joined here today with Matt, aka Warchamp. Matt, we were just talking about some classic leading men, and one of these films, at least, has kind of one of those, I guess you could call it golden age leading men. That is Jimmy Stewart, of course. And I think you could maybe throw in Burt Lancaster for our other film in this double feature. And first of all, before we get too deep into it, how are you doing? And what good movies have you been watching recently?
I'm doing pretty well. An interesting movie I liked a lot recently, besides the ones we're talking about today, was called The Doom Generation. I watched it a few nights ago. It's a Greg Araki movie, if you've heard of him. He's directed that movie like Mysterious Skin, which is I think pretty famous, and he has a lot of kind of crazy, slightly messed up movies that are pretty interesting.
I do appreciate when a director, like, there's varying degrees of messed up, but when directors can take subject matter and kind of show off maybe the, I don't know if this is the right word to describe it, but disturbing aspects of a subject matter, that always interests me. um and kind of parlaying that into one of the movies we watched, Judgment at Nuremberg, it's almost the inverse of that, where it takes a very extremely polarizing subject matter and it kind of fleshes it out for you. Did you have that same experience watching Judgment at Nuremberg?
Yeah, to me it felt a lot like I was really seeing how a trial would go down about, what happened in the Holocaust and just, the Nazi crimes in general. Just because, the length of the movie helps kind of let you get involved with the different characters, like the prosecution, the defense, and the judge. And then you really see a lot of the arguments for why these people should and should not be held accountable. And you're kind of, left to make your own decision in your head. So I feel like, yeah, it was very realistic and it wasn't really uh, nothing was dramatized a lot. There's some in there obviously, but it wasn't overdone.
Yes, yes, yeah. And I thought, not jumping to the rating or anything, but suffice to say, I thought both movies were very enjoyable and very well executed. And the surprising piece, for me at least, and obviously I have not seen a tremendous amount of films from the time period in which both of these were shot, but speaking for myself, I was not familiar with either of the directors for Anatomy of a Murder and for Judgment at Nuremberg. Um, can the same be said for you, Matt, or had you watched some of their filmography prior to watching these two movies?
No, so I'm actually not familiar with Stanley Kramer, the Judgment at Nuremberg director. Hadn't really heard of him much before. But Odo Preminger is in the they call the Archers. Him and this other guy, I'm trying to think of the name. They did the movie Black Narcissus. Or sorry,
Oh,
it's or, I think I'm getting that correct. It's like Emmerich Pressburger and Odo Preminger. I think maybe not Black Narcissus, but I thought I had seen them work on movies together before, but maybe I'm getting that wrong.
the I have seen that film on HBO Max, and I had it on my watch list. I didn't know um, that it was the same director. That would have been neat. I probably would have checked it out after watching this because of how much I liked Anatomy of a Murder. Um, But that's a pretty cool tie-in, and I have to.
Actually, hold on. I just want to say I looked it up and it's actually false. I just got the names mixed up. I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries whatsoever. Um, and something else is that about these films is they introduce kind of very specific and interesting legal matters that I think have a tremendous footprint in the world of law. Matt, which you are much more acquainted than I, but even from I guess a novice point of view, Anatomy of a Murder seems to really cover what we now consider a crime of passion. I guess maybe as that precedent was truly being set. And then obviously, Judgment at Nuremberg, that is tremendously impactful because it almost, again, sets precedent as to how far the arm of justice reaches when it comes to culpability for crimes. And although maybe if you're looking through it at a certain lens, the people who are following orders were then kind of required to take responsibility for that, and there is kind of a twist at the end in the epilogue, which I thought was really impactful. But just speaking from your experience, I mean, how impactful did you find these movies to be in law yourself?
Yeah, so for Anatomy of a Murder, that specific type of legal defense, the crime of passion, was one we discussed a lot because it's not normally something that's used, but uh, in some states or at certain times it was used. And the reason we discuss it so much is because it's such a gray area because you're arguing about the mental state of someone at the time they were going to murder someone else. It's very hard to find evidence that shows with certainty that someone was thinking a certain thing. So that kind of thing is debated, and it's important in the legal field. And for Judgment at Nuremberg, I haven't really taken any classes that goes over, military tribunals or international law, and that stuff is very complex and it's just different than regular American law just because of the fact that I'm guessing they're trying to, merge the laws of as many countries as possible to come up with a a fair way to do things. And I'm also assuming that in Nuremberg it was governed by American law because there were American judges there. But I'm sure there's a whole different set of rules when something is happening internationally, and I haven't really learned about that yet. But it was very interesting to see.
Yeah, you bring up a really good point when it comes to Judgment at Nuremberg, just because that's such a specific circumstance that you do not see often, and that is just it makes perfect sense as to the why, right? Why we were kind of called upon, or why we insisted on prosecuting people kind of outside of our jurisdiction, for lack of a better term. But it's just unique and interesting, and it maybe happens more frequently than what I'm privy to, but I would imagine it's only brought out in the most extreme of circumstances.
Yeah, because you could tell at the beginning. One thing I could tell was the judge seemed a little, unsure of what he was doing, and that continues on throughout the film. And it's not just because the weight is on his shoulders of whether these people should be sent to prison or not, but he's trying to make a decision for the entirety of the United States basically in this specific military situation. So it's not like he's likely not a Supreme Court justice, isn't used to making, huge decisions like this that can impact the entire United States. That was another thing I was thinking about, because yeah, you're getting into a lot of different types of rules when you do military types of trials, and you're held to very different standards in military trials.
And what, from a legal perspective, not only the international trial aspect of it, but the fact that this movie portrays the story in which four judges are being held on trial. So people who understand the law are being put on trial because of, I guess, the actions that they took under the Nazi regime. Um, and if I get too far ahead of myself and you want to bring something up, by all means. But what is very interesting about this movie, aside from the legal aspects, is it paints a very accurate picture of what the political landscape would likely be during this time. And you can feel through the discussions happening with the characters that the fear of communism growing begins to outweigh the want and need for punishment. Um, and I think that speaks volumes as to what can affect trials. And obviously, as a judge, your your motive is to stay completely unbiased, but we oftentimes see news cycles pick up stories and they can oftentimes impact not only the verdict but also the severity of the verdict.
Yeah, and I thought, the interesting part of the movie on that point was how the judge was trying so hard to keep himself unbiased. And I think that was, when he uh, tried to befriend and talk to Marina Dietrich's character. I don't think that's her correct first name, but her last name's Dietrich. She's the famous actress that he talks to about her husband being in the army and how she didn't know. He's trying to, I guess, kind of figure out in general how much knowledge and culpability people had. So maybe he could, translate that to, well, how much did a judge know? Did a judge know, for example, that was he involved or made decisions about the film they showed, the gas chambers and stuff like that? Because, that was another, uh, strategy the prosecution used to make people feel bad. And that it was a lot of it was it, uh, kind of a bias. They were trying to introduce more bias, like when they were asking, which party one of the witnesses was for, like were they a Nazi, and when they showed that film video. So it was a lot of emotional type of aspects that were going on, or emotional arguments.
Which, in the case of law, a lot of people might think I want to just know the hard facts of the matter, but so often, especially in film, but in any court case that I have knowledge of, thanks to docu-series or documentaries or what have you, emotional calls to emotion are generally used and seem the most effective, especially whenever you're trying to prosecute.
Yeah, they're good in trials. They're good for convincing juries, and there's no jury here, but it's different and it still works because that judge is, impacted himself by the war, just like everybody in that room. So in this case, it doesn't matter as much.
Absolutely. The one thing that I do really want to say, and I don't think the film would be nearly as impactful, important, or as well executed if it had not done this, is that the leading attorney for the defense, played by Maximilian Schell, was, I think, the standout of all the actors involved. I thought he was the best, and I also think that the script writers and producers and director did something very unconventional, and I maybe brave is the right word, by giving the fully fledged argument in defense of those four judges who, presided during the Nazi regime. I think had it been an entirely one-sided affair and the movie was just trying to highlight how bad the Nazis were and how culpable people were involved, the movie would have not been nearly as interesting. I think getting a full scope of the matter made the movie interesting. At least as far as I'm concerned. Matt, did you feel the same way?
Yeah, I felt the same way, 100%. That was the reason I think I liked the movie more than anything else, was how you got there was not a good guy and a bad guy. The defense attorney, I thought at the beginning was gonna end up being the main character. And you could say the judge kind of was, but we still got to see, the prosecutor, the defender, or the defense attorney all go about and, try and make the best case for their side, while at the same time they were all impacted by how horrific it was. And I also think that that character that played the defense attorney, or that actor, was the best, just because it really got through to me, or at least like by way of his expressions, his facial expressions, and the way he was saying things, how he seemed like he was trying to defend them as hard as he could, and he seemed very uh, just very enthusiastic about trying to defend Germany, or defend the judges in the case that they themselves should be innocent. But at the same time, you could see how he might not fully agree. It was just like he was affected in the same way. He seemed just as upset, but he seemed so determined to bring justice and to still be the best defense attorney he could. That he was just a very uh, interesting and deep character.
Yeah, the passion with which he brought to the podium whenever he was defending his clients seemed entirely genuine. You could tell it was a trial that meant a lot to him, and the actor did a tremendous job at bringing that to the screen. And part of some of the points that he brought up in trying to unveil the hypocrisy of the people who were judging his defendants, I thought were some of the most interesting points of his defense. Um, when it comes to the internment, Japanese internment camps, when it comes to the laws put in place due to the widespread nature of communism at the time of which this was released, and also how he alluded to the fact that, look, if you think we were all aware, how couldn't you have been aware with what Hitler was doing? You saw these laws being passed too, so the finger has to be pointed at everyone. And he made such a great case that I didn't know which way the judge was going to go, and I also felt very conflicted myself if I were in the judge's shoes, I really I don't know what I would have done either.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I kept thinking, how would I make this decision if I were the judge? And I couldn't really figure out what I would do. That would take me a lot of time of thinking. Uh, but yeah, I also completely agree that his most compelling argument was the fact that, Americans have also committed some pretty bad war crimes. I mean, nothing in comparison to the Holocaust, obviously. But I think the thing that rings most, you know, or the as the best argument for me is that you're only going to really get in trouble for those crimes, I guess, if you lose the war, or
Mm,
if you're the other guys are now the ones coming in. It's an American court, it's not a German court, so you're now under their rules, and that's kind of just when you get screwed, because there there may be some people that get punished by American military tribunals, other Americans that may have committed terrible war crimes, but people like judges that may have also been a little corrupt in some decisions aren't going to be taken to a military tribunal, most likely, unless it's more blatant. But yeah, I think what really got them in the end, and what may have convinced me to vote the same way that the judge in the film did, was that the individual cases they brought up, where you could see they were clearly biased and corrupt when sentencing certain people to execution, which I think that's a pretty hard thing to defend against.
yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think when it comes to like anyone in the legal profession, and you understand like that is your life, your life's work, is dedicated to justice. And for the three people on the tribunal, someone who, I would imagine all three of them had very long lasting careers where they've spent the majority of their years in a pursuit of justice, to see someone who is their German counterpart enact it in a way that you could argue is evil, I think does truly seal the deal, as far as making the decision. And I can't remember distinctly what was said, but I do remember it was a very poignant kind of final line of dialogue between the head of the tribunal and Burt Lancaster, and it was something along the lines of you knew exactly what you were doing the first time you prosecuted or persecuted an innocent person, and that was what everything boiled down to. I think that was something that he could not get out of his mind from the very first day in court, but he finally saw it clearly, and that was all he needed to know to come to his decision.
Yeah, I remember that scene. I think that's the last one, or it's like the second to last one. And he might say persecuted, he might have said executed the innocent man, but either way, yeah, because I feel like at that point you do feel stuck. Like if you put yourself in the position of the judge, what would you do? You feel like this is your country. How are you just going to get up and leave like one of the most prestigious legal positions that can be held as, a high up judge? Um, it would, but at the same time, you can say, well, think about what you're doing here. You're literally killing an innocent person. You would say your morals would have to overtake you uh, to get you to up and leave, and that's what you should do. But this is why it's not American law at all, because you could. I mean, unless it's considered treason or something, we're prosecuting someone in an entirely different country. So it's kind of like the judge. I don't even know if he's using much law here, much case precedent. I think a lot of it is he's just trying to figure out what's correct himself, and him, I guess, and the two other judges, one who does dissent, have to come up with a decision.
Yeah, and this might have just been a creative choice for the movie, but at least like in other legal movies that we've watched and discussed via podcast, the legal precedent will oftentimes be kind of like the glimmer of hope for one side or another, and that doesn't seem like either prosecutor or defendant are kind of trying that route. So I agree with you. I kind of think it's like they're almost rolling on like an international level where precedents don't really matter. Um, I do think, aside from the slideshow, the prosecutor's role in this, I guess there was actually, I was gonna say he wasn't as memorable, but now that I think back upon it, there was definitely a lot of memorable things that he did, but I think it's just reminding you of aspects or illuminating aspects that are already kind of things that you semi know as a viewer and then probably as a judge as well. But it's equally effective just because it keeps your eye on the ball as far as this is what they're being punished for. Um, the point that I was trying to get to though is that I did find the defense to be way more memorable and tactful as far as what they were doing, and I think part of that is because they had such an uphill battle.
Yeah. Besides the one time the prosecutor goes to get the witness and convince her to testify, it's mostly uh, it kind of evolves, I feel like, into you get to see more of the perspective from the judges in the prison as well, and you get to see the defense attorney start struggling with his defense. When I guess his client, Ernst, uh, Burt Lancaster's character, basically has a complete conversion. He kind of, maybe it seems like this realization of what he had done was completely wrong, and he gives that pretty well crafted speech towards the end of the movie as well.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the yeah, the change of heart that Burt Lancaster has, he seems like at peace with his, I guess, persecution, but then at the end it's like he wants to convince the judge that even though in an aspect he's guilty, he's not a bad person. Um, and I like, how was your understanding of the psychology of that? Like, what was his mindset from your perspective?
See, that's tough. What I think, based on how his character acts, and a lot of it is just his facial expressions and how they change. It seems like, he knows what he was doing was wrong, and I think he's kind of like, when you're in the Nazi regime, and this is something you've been doing for a long time, like him, it kind of just all becomes normal, I would think. And if you're a judge, making decisions, maybe once you've executed the first person, you're like, wow, I can't believe I let that happen. But then over time, it just becomes more normalized. And as you're living in the, Nazi regime, and, you're surrounded by other people who are only Nazis, it probably just becomes a very, it's maybe a little hush hush that they're killing Jewish people and executing them, and they're corrupt against them. But I feel like, as people, we adapt to things, and you just adapt to that. And then I take this movie as kind of his uh, realization. It's just like a continued realization throughout the film that this was not normal at all. And what he did was wrong, and he did, even though he may not have killed people himself, he played a huge role in it. And I think he just starts to feel really guilty. And I think that at the very end, he just wants to think he might not really be a bad person on the inside. And I think he just wants to kind of prove that to the judge or other people that he's not really a bad person. I feel like, because when you feel bad, you start to think, I'm just a terrible person. I think he starts to feel that way, after the video and everything he gets shown at the trial.
I think that makes perfect sense, and I think you're dead right. And I think he's at peace with the judgment, but like you said, he doesn't want to believe that he's a bad person, and he's more so trying to convince himself that um, as well. And one of the I think the most powerful, maybe not, because the footage from the aftermath of the Holocaust is by far the most powerful moment of this film, in my opinion, just because of its real world impact. But I think the most surprising point is the very very end, in which there's kind of a blurb, and it shows the I guess the actual time spent in jail by these four who were prosecuted. And if I remember correctly, I think the four did not spend more than 5 years in jail, which I thought was very interesting, and it's something that this film kind of alludes to throughout its runtime, in that the U.S. attention is moving towards different things, and people are not interested in the Nuremberg trials anymore. Um, what did you think about the ending yourself? And then I guess, were you surprised at all by that? I guess that blurb at the end.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. I didn't really know the history of the Nuremberg trials before I watched this movie, even though I do love World War II history. I was familiar that they went on trial, but I didn't, know the details. I would have thought that, I could see it both ways. So I would have thought that, in one way, this is the kind of, event like the Holocaust that people never forget. And, as long as humans are living, it will always be in the history books. So I would think that if they sentenced them, they would have stayed in there. But then on the flip side, one, you could say at the time it happened, there were people that were living and, just in the middle of their life that had fully experienced the atrocities, that wanted to see these people be held accountable. And also, there was probably, I'm unfamiliar with if there was probably some legal stuff that went down in terms of, they didn't do something procedurally correct, or they appealed based on something that happened in the trial, that a higher court then found that that appeal, or they granted that appeal. And they said, okay, since, they screwed the trial up and it was maybe you wouldn't say unconstitutional since this is an American law, but, it was like unjust, then they're going to release him, or they're going to do a new trial or something. And then maybe in the new trial, they didn't get found guilty. I'm sure the detail lot of ways. And I'm guessing it was one of those legal things, just like how Bill Cosby got off on a technicality that ended up, getting them released.
Yeah, and speaking to your point, it is very very surprising. This is slightly different because this was a Nazi officer who worked in one of the concentration camps. I believe he worked in Auschwitz. But I watched a Netflix documentary. I think it's called The Devil Next Door. It's about a man who lived in like Cleveland, Ohio, and was identified as they believed he was a Nazi officer, and he went in on trial. I was trying to think of it. It's the name of it's like a joint state. It's Palestine and not Jerusalem. What's the name of it, Matt?
Um, are you are you talking about a country?
Yeah, they are like oftentimes at war with Palestine.
Uh, like Israel?
Is that it?
I mean, what state are you talking about? Like, there's Syria. You talking about Syria?
I can't think of the name. I'm trying to look at a map right. It is in Jerusalem, but isn't it Israel? That's what I was trying to
Yeah,
think of.
Israel.
Sorry. Um,
Oh, okay.
but I think the trials took place in Israel, and it was I don't even know. Like it was like a civil rights trial type of deal. But I think they ended up putting this Nazi officer who went in hiding to death in like the 1980s into the maybe even the 1990s. So like there was very clearly, especially by the people affected, a sentiment of they wanted justice still. Um, so I am sure that a lot of people were outraged, but I wanted to kind of parlay this into a like old timey political discussion in that I think that ending blurb does really greatly highlight how the attentions of the United States turned because of the Cold War, and I keep mentioning that, but we were so desperate also to try to gain help from kind of these leftover agents from these great empires from Germany and especially Japan. And I think this is something that doesn't get brought up often enough, but we did see the German officers, a lot of them punished, but Japan really didn't get punished outside of the two atomic bombs we dropped on them. But if you look at what officers did in terms of the rape of Nanking and some of the diabolical scientific studies they did on Chinese human beings, there's a lot of blood on their hands as well that really didn't get punished quite the same way that the Germans did.
Yeah, yeah. I, it's interesting because I've never really heard about any trials for, the Japanese higher ups. But I think, maybe a lot of it, I think a lot of the injustice might have just been that, or the things people were upset about was that they were executing all those Jewish people. And Israel was created, right after the war in like 1948 as a place for the Jewish people to go. So, you know, in my mind, I think that, and this is me being unfamiliar really with like what the news was like in like the late 40s after the war in the early 50s. But I would imagine that like the news that was going around everywhere was just how bad it was for the Jewish people in general, how millions had been killed. And I think that people worldwide and still to this day people still feel it. There's just an urge to find all the people that specifically, you know, caused that event and hold them accountable. And I think that that caused other terrible things to get swept under the rug. Even though Holocaust was terrible, and all those people should have been held accountable. I think that stuff like the Rape of Nanking just doesn't. It's more of something you have to read more history to learn about. It's not going to get taught in every history class like the Holocaust will.
And I know this is a difficult question to answer, but from your point of view, do you think the political leanings of China closer to, and then finally communism post World War II, was maybe one of the biggest contributing factors to the US not trying to persecute Japanese, officers or anyone in Japan post war, because they weren't on our team anymore? Does that make sense? And what are your thoughts on it?
Um, well, I think from what I like and from what I just remember learning about is that didn't we try and like take over Japan in a way, like not, you know, colonize, but we tried to turn them into a society more like ourselves, like a capitalist society as opposed to a communist one. I don't really remember, or I'm not really familiar with how involved or like what we did with the Chinese government. But I think they were at that time they were definitely going in a super communist direction. But I honestly don't know enough about Chinese history.
Yeah, I'm not sure at which point I painting the narrative in my head, and because my memory is terrible, and honestly in classes you don't really learn about Chinese history and what got them to communism, but I would feel as oftentimes post war when you're kind of looking for something to unite after like the great tragedies they went through. I think that's probably why they went that way and felt like they would have a protector in Russia. And speaking to your point about Japan, they did seem to, whether it was a a focused effort that made it so on our behalf. I mean, they are very capitalistic now, and they have cities with neon lights, and obviously they have a lot of like farmland to this day. But it does seem like the most Americanized version in the East. So, and I don't know what inspired that, but it did seem like we kind of quickly forgave the Japanese, which is, I do think, you can't blame the people, but there was experiments being done that were equally as grotesque, though it didn't outnumber the Holocaust. I don't know if you've heard, I think we've discussed this on podcasts before, but there was something, it's called Unit 731 in Japan. Have you ever heard of Unit 731?
No, I haven't. I don't know if we've discussed that before.
They, and there's a movie about this, and I think I can't remember exactly, something under the sun, I think, and it goes over some of the experiments that they do, but it's very very close to what Joseph Mengele is kind of known for, but they were doing it. There wasn't really one figurehead. It was kind of a unit of scientists who were using Chinese POWs or civilians that were taken prisoner. Um, like one such experiment was, in freezing cold temperatures, they would pour water on the hands of these Chinese people, and then they took a sledgehammer and smashed it to see what would happen to their limbs. And from their records, their hands would break off once they became frozen completely through. And that's just one example of a multitude of some really terrible things that they have done.
Jeez, yeah, that is terrible. Uh, yeah, that's. I mean, it, it's crazy the lengths the governments will or the militaries will go to. I guess when they have all this power. I guess the one thing I could say that because I mean, you look across these different countries during World War II, and it's like everybody ends up sinking to their lowest in terms of morality.
I agree with that, and it's the I think the most important sentiment is that the what is it? The road to hell is paved with good intention, I think is how the saying goes. And like these governments, these governmental systems become blinded to the inhumanity with which they're treating people because they think by doing so they're like setting their country on the wrong path. But that's literally the only thing I can say in my head to think how can people be capable of such bad things on a countrywide level.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting that the different in this case you see the different countries kind of have their own uh like cultures, and that kind of morphs the way they like torture people or how they act during the war. Like Japan, they're very like the suicide bombers, or the tradition they have where they'll I think believe they'll like kill themselves if they fail in battle before they get taken prisoner. I could be completely off base, but there's as the cultures and different things change, different countries do different things, and I it made me think about Deer Hunter, and how the Vietnamese did things. They were more they seem to like to use the soldiers as entertainment. It's just very it's interesting, and a lot of different movies kind of portray that.
Yeah, and it is extremely interesting, and you can even kind of see from our perspective, and I don't think, I mean, I'm clearly biased, but I don't think it's so much programming here. But boot camp is just to try to get you in a killer mindset. And when you look at studies as to why it is necessary and why they generally like younger recruits, is because it's harder to get older soldiers to kind of follow those orders, like not blindly, but to follow orders that might put them in harm's way or to harm others. Because once your brain is fully formed, you start to maybe think of things differently than an 18-year-old recruit would. And it's talking to like basic training, it's to get you into this kind of mind state where you do things instinctually as opposed to like thinking through things. But this time period is just far and away so unique because both Japan and Germany were thinking of their enemies when it came to the Jewish race and the Chinese as less than human. And to be able to do that on such a widespread scale is the only thing that made these atrocities possible.
Yeah, I think that is so true about converting soldiers young, especially in these times when war was a little more commonplace. They had just had World War I not all that long ago. But with the propaganda and making it look like it'll be something good to do, when you're 18, that just looks exciting to a lot of people. It never did to me, but I can see, thinking back to when I was 18, how if I would have been even somewhat interested in the military, it would have been very easy to convince me to join it. But now that I'm older, and I would think through it a little more, and I think you just have more stuff you care about, more you realize more things as you get older. You also lose that feeling of invincibility that you usually have when you're younger. And I think all those things play a role in how they kind of recruit their members. But then you have to also think when they recruit them, what kind of culture are they recruiting them into. And as I was saying earlier, they kind of each have their own distinctive one. And a lot of the times for these, for countries like Japan or Germany in World War II, it was a very aggressive type of mentality you were brought into. And when groups like that get together that are, very they basically become more extremists. So the hate for Americans, by the Japanese in that time was probably at an all-time high.
Yeah, and speaking to like what you were talking about with Japan, with the kamikaze pilots, they w- both countries actually had this kind of powder keg as to something that could explode into this national fervor and entire support. The complete breakdown of the German government post World War One is greatly explaining the rise of a national party such as the Nazis, and to get people all on board to make Germany the greatest country in the world after this kind of momentous fall. And I think that is why people get so blinded to it. And I think why soldiers there were kind of proud to be doing what they were doing because they thought it was for the greater good. And on the Eastern Front, you have the Japanese soldiers who are from this samurai era, with no means to really to put all of that culture and those aspirations towards, and they finally have something to become a great empire once again and to be the samurai of old. And that is actually, like you were saying, they would die before they would be captured. That's from a samurai, um, like nobility kind of phrase or way of life, rather, where it's death before dishonor. Like, as a samurai, you would rather die than dishonor your country. So that is why they would be so willing to dive bomb into battleships or anything else, because they would be honoring their country by doing so. So it's two of the most unique kind of war or army cultures of all time, and it's honestly kind of mind-blowing that they both happen simultaneously.
Yeah, I think you kind of described both of them perfectly. Uh, for the German one, I think they said it in the movie. I can't remember who said it, but I think it was Burt Lancaster's character. He said it was like the old tale of the sacrificial lamb. How for the German culture, how they had just come from their version of a Great Depression, probably even worse. And now they have someone saying, well, if you get rid of all of you know, the Jewish people, the gypsies, and all the non-Aryans, then all your problems will be fixed. And the person saying that just had so much charisma to where enough people believed it, and it just, you know, developed into this crazy situation. Um, yeah.
One last piece that I want to speak on, and why I think this movie is becoming more timely than maybe it would have been 10 or 15 years ago is because and I'm sure you've seen bits and pieces of this in the media, but in popular media, um, there are it seems like there's becoming more of a microphone pointed towards people who are kind of dissenters when it comes to opinions that would have seemed formed just a couple decades ago. As far as the Holocaust, I think more people are speaking as deniers of the Holocaust, not as to the number, as to the existence of it, and I think Kanye West is probably the most prominent person who has kind of came out against this, and there is seemingly a more anti-Jewish sentiment that has been going around in different forms of media now more than the last couple of decades, which I think makes a movie like this very very important for the 21st century, which I don't think a lot of people would have recognized or expected.
Yeah, I think what it has been in terms of people denying it is people just question the statistics and where they came from. And I think that's a weird subculture for me to be like. It's just like it. I don't understand. I've never understood why the Jewish people have seemingly been prosecuted for. I mean, even in biblical times, that was a big deal. Was Jewish people were targeted. And I probably just haven't done enough research into the history of why, but it just seems to be a very just like the kind of story that has been going on since mankind started, was blaming specifically Jewish people, and it's not just Jewish people in general. I think people also want to blame anyone they can ostracize in terms of, like, if they're in a position of power, like Hitler. Like, if it were Arabic people that were primarily in the country, that's probably who he would have been pointing the finger at. Um, but it's just it's a way for people to control and blame other people in order to promote their own uh, it, their own policies or whatever. And I think Kanye, the Kanye case, I really don't know why he's saying, like, all that. I think maybe his angle is that all these people, maybe that these people that he doesn't like running, like Adidas or whoever he was beefing with, are Jewish. Maybe that's what he's saying, but I haven't read too much into that.
I think you brought up a really good point, and it kind of made a revelation for me. It because of why Jewish people have been prosecuted for numerous times throughout the history of the world. And I think specifically when it comes to the Holocaust, you hit the nail on the head. It is about the fact that there was an opportunity for them to be ostracized. And I think it's because it's a religion that, while it is more widespread than some religions on a global scale in comparison to Christianity and to Islam, it's much more insulated. It's generally a religion that people are born into because of how hard it is to join the Judaism religion. And I think that really hits the nail on the head, and it makes a lot of sense to me personally as to why they were kind of easy targets, because it was a religion that people maybe knew others who were Jewish, but they were a small enough number to where they could be picked on without being outnumbered themselves, I guess.
Yeah, like they're like they're an insulated community and they might not like outsiders to them very much, which kind of, just in general human being terms makes other people not trust them as much. Because, if people aren't trusting towards you, that's going to make you not want to trust them.
Yes. I think you hit the nail on the head. Um, we discussed another black and white law movie recently. That was 12 Angry Men, and I think that maybe is perhaps the most popular legal drama on the big screen. And I have all three of these in a row, and I have 12 Angry Men right on board with it. A long story short, I gave this film a 4.5, just like 12 Angry Men, and I think there's a argument to be made that this is maybe even better than that, and perhaps the best legal drama I've ever seen. Matt, what did you rate this film, and how do you think of it in terms of that subgenre?
I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. In terms of the subgenre, I'm trying to, I'd say this one is most similar to 12 Angry Men, just because you are seeing courtroom proceedings, but I feel like the case is about way more than just the trial, whereas more like Anatomy of the Murder, it's kind of like an enclosed story. So, it's kind of trying to say something more about justice, like a more meta level. Um, so I think this one for me, it's hard to know if I would rank it above 12. I think I might have it slightly above 12 Angry Men. But these are all going to be tied with this legal movie we haven't discussed. That's way different than this kind of movie called Primal Fear, which I think I've
Mm,
mentioned on our other podcast. I really like that one, just because it's in the entertainment aspect. I feel like this, like a Judgment of Nuremberg and 12 Angry Men, is going to be a type of movie that simulates more intellectually. Gets me thinking about bigger topics. Whereas a movie like Primal Fear, or even you could say The Verdict, is just more like entertainment.
yeah, I agree. And Primal Fear has a tremendous performance by Richard Gere, but a one of the best performances of all time by Edward Norton. That's a great movie, and it really explores the pathology of a defendant. And I do love that film, and I want to touch on it because you brought it up. But I think what makes that film brilliant from a legal standpoint, obviously, it is greatly entertaining, but it I guess poses the question, or statement rather, where Richard Gere says, "My truth is the only one that matters," and once he gets his truth to become to point the jury rather into the direction, or it actually doesn't go to the jury, but once he gets the verdict that he wants according to his truth, he realizes that his truth isn't everything that matters once he has the revelation of Edward Norton actually being evil, which I think makes that movie brilliant.
Yes, yes, I love that part. Yeah, I like that movie because, to me, more than anything else, it's about kind of like the plight of the defense attorney. Uh, like what that job can be like. It's interesting for a lot more reasons than that, but I really just love Richard Gere's character in that film.
And just to sum up Judgment at Nuremberg, this movie made 16 million at box office, which for its time period I feel like is probably pretty solid numbers. But on top of that, this film won 2 Academy Awards, and one of them, surprisingly perhaps, is Maximilian Schell, the defense attorney, won Best Actor and then the screenplay won an Academy Award for Best Screenplay based on material from another medium. So this film was pretty critically acclaimed. It got nominated for a bunch of stuff, and it won a couple of awards. And to me, that's what made this film surprising from a standpoint that I had not heard of it until you recommended it.
Yeah, I knew about this movie even before I started law school, and I just never got around to it, mostly because it was so long, I think. But yeah, this is I didn't actually realize that it received all those awards, to be honest, either until I think like right before I watched it. I looked it up and read a little bit about it. But yeah, I guess that, maybe back in the early 60s, this is probably a really big deal, when everyone was still, you know, 12 years later taking in the Holocaust and still trying to process it.
Absolutely. The next film that we watched is Anatomy of a Murder, led by Jimmy Stewart, of course. This is a film in which Ben Gazzara, one of John Cassavetes' frequent actors, he is a military officer whose wife gets sexually assaulted, and after that heinous action takes place, Gazzara enacts revenge upon the responsible party and murders a bar owner. This is definitely, in terms of morality and what's right and what isn't right, this is not as complex as Judgment at Nuremberg. And I do think part of that is because American audiences like myself, and I'm sure even more specifically you, because you have a legal background and you've read about cases, it does seem like because you know so much about crime of passion, and that's like a household term now, that we've actually kind of explored this on a level to where we're actually quite familiar with a scenario like what this film is portraying. Uh, did you feel that way yourself?
Yeah, yeah. You kind of mean that maybe it was ahead of its time, and like it's become much more of a kind of defense now, and like nowadays we do see a lot of people trying to plead insanity for various reasons because that might be the only defense left.
Oh, absolutely. I do. I think this is well ahead of its time.
Yeah, yeah. I I think of that one scene where he's kind of discovering the precedent for this in his law library. And I'm thinking, now that back then that was a lot of how you might have found a law. It might have really taken a lot of search through different legal books to find what you want. But now in the legal field, there's still lots of questions that pop up that cause you to do a lot of digging, but a lot of stuff is kind of generally known and it can just be found on the internet. So it's a very different like ball field that people are playing in nowadays.
Yeah, and I guess what's interesting in respect to that, and I don't expect you to know this because it's not. You probably don't, like you said, you don't have to do this anymore. Um, but back then, I don't even know like how you would begin to look for a precedent that would be relevant. But now, I mean, if you were to use like keyword search, would you basically have like someone stating their opinion on the precedent and how it relates to certain types of cases? So if you just typed in crime of passion on whatever database you're using, it would probably point you towards the legal precedent behind that. Is that accurate towards what you would use now? And secondly, and I know this will be difficult, but I mean, how would you have gone about it back in this time period?
Yeah, so basically what you said is probably the easiest way to describe it. You just get onto this data, or there's several different databases you can use, and you could find instantly when you looked up like a crime of passion law in Texas, not only will it point you to current precedent, but you'll get to see tons and tons of secondary sources, which would be like different journals, books, and articles, all legal ones that have been published that are about crime of passion. So it'll kind of walk you through like the history of how it developed in Texas, and the case precedents, like what are the big cases and what do they say about the law. And then you could also easily find any statutes, which would just be like laws that a law that might specifically say you can or can't use the crime of passion defense. Back then, you just have to, I'm once like I don't know 100% sure, but from what my idea of it is that all of that stuff I just mentioned, all those reports, secondary sources, the cases, those would all be physical copies. So that means you have to go in to a huge law library and spend a lot of time looking for, okay, there probably would be some sort of index or something, and they might tell you, what books are there on crime of passion, and you go read those, and they might tell you about certain cases. And then you go find those cases in different legal books. But the hardest thing is if you're really trying to search for maybe something that's not as obvious, a more intricate question, something not as general as just crime of passion law in Texas, then finding precedent for that is going to be extremely tough, and it's going to cause you to have to look through all these what they call reporters, which are just these lists or this like collection of different cases that have came out. Some can be organized by what type of law they're on and whatnot, but it would cause you to have to read tons and tons of legal cases that are completely irrelevant just to try and find something that's kind of on point. So yeah, that's the really good part of the internet and legal research, is that typing like keywords in can just bring you to a lot of relevant information, even if it's an intricate question or a harder to find question.
And I think, like, based on what you're saying, and I think it's still enacted now, but I would imagine specifically with this time period why judges would want to roll specifically based on precedent is because you risk creating a new precedent, which then is going to kind of gum up the works, or mix up a lot of future cases if you kind of create a precedent after there has already been one, because of how resource heavy and how much reading has to be done already. If you create more and more precedents, then I mean there could be technically a legal argument for everything in every direction, kind of. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, yeah. So like in the legal field, there are or there is like a rule basically that you can't create a new president without, you have to overrule it, and if you overrule it you need to give a new reason why. But people overrule cases without explicitly stating it pretty often, and the the way that gets messy is that you can't, like a court of appeals in Texas couldn't overrule the Texas Supreme Court because their Supreme Court's the highest, and I'm just using Texas as an example of a state. There's also the national Supreme Court, but just like any court of appeals is always going to be under the Supreme Court. So whenever there's like discrepancies, whenever the court of appeals might have ruled something that's a little bit off precedent, or they might have made some remarks, then people are going to start using their remarks when they're trying to argue against like a Supreme Court precedent. Um, and and then the way that gets resolved is you have to hope a case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they themselves are like, okay, Court of Appeals, y'all need to stop enforcing this rule, and they'll explicitly like say their opinion. And then kind of what a good example, because this might be a little confusing, my explanation, is what just happened with the affirmative action thing. So that was, the Supreme Court just overruled their precedent that they had set before about allowing affirmative action, and now they're walking back on that. Same with the abortion thing that was ruled a couple years ago.
That is very interesting, and it makes perfect sense as well. Um, and you might have touched upon this, but I didn't explicitly catch it myself. Who is like the enforcer of, hey, you kind of like, obviously with the affirmative action and abortion, those are like very, very well known legal precedents. But if you were to unintentionally go against a legal precedent, how would they go about, like, retrospectively? Okay, now you kind of have to explain why you went against this precedent that took place in the past.
So I guess the best way to explain it is something I learned this year, and this would be an easier way to think about it. So there was like this law where, and I'm just going to simplify this because I don't want to get into all the details, but like the cops used to not be allowed to search your car, like when they arrested you and something like that. Well, like if you get arrested in your car, they used to not be able to search it, and then there was like some high up court cases that started allowing them to search cars. And then someone brought a lawsuit. This is a case I learned about, against people, against cops who had searched the car before the precedent was changed. But then the courts decided to just make an exception and be like, or I'm sorry, I totally explained that wrong. It's the opposite. So they used to be able to search their car, and then the Supreme Court said, okay, you can't anymore. And then they tried to sue the people who did search the car in the past, and they said, now that the precedent has changed, it doesn't matter. So basically, short version, I thought that I was gonna be able to explain that much better than I did. I apologize. Is that if the precedent changes, you're not going to be able to get in trouble if you were doing things under the correct one beforehand.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. Just some quick highlights that I want to bring up about this film. I did this at the end with the previous one, but I want to bring it up with Anatomy of Murder. This made $8 million in comparison to Judgment at Nuremberg, $16 million. Got nominated for a handful of Academy Awards, did not take any home, but it has James Stewart as kind of the face of it. Ben Gazzara, who's also a really good actor, plays his role very well. Maybe lesser known, but it also has George C. Scott as one of the prosecuting attorneys, and I thought he was really good. And I want to ask you a twofold question. One, kind of both your opinion, but what did you think of the acting of this film? And the secondary question, what did you think about how the legal process was kind of depicted in this film?
The actors I thought were great. The two things I got excited about when I first saw the opening credits was that Ben Gazzara was in it, just because I loved him so much and Killing of a Chinese Bookie. And I just also wanted to shout out the soundtrack, Duke Ellington. I think it's great. But yeah, I like the acting. The acting. I thought, uh, the Manions. I believe there's their last name, Laura and Ben Gazzara's character. I
Mm,
thought they both, had very interesting characters. Um, uh, you have the girl who you're not sure, you know, exactly what happened. Is she saying that to try and get her husband out of jail? You're not sure, or did something really happen? You don't really. It kind of goes back and forth where you don't know if it actually was consensual and she's lying, or you don't know if it really did happen because she was, beaten up. So there's a lot of depth to these characters as well as her husband. You kind of know that uh he probably was heard about what happened, and whether or not it was consensual, he was probably going over there to kill that guy one way or the other. So, you eh, that I think that mystery added a lot to the story for me and helped me really get into it. In terms of the legal process, I thought, it was definitely better than a lot of the ones I'd seen. Um, First of all, the fact that they were arguing so much about getting that evidence in terms of like being able to talk about her rape case in the murder trial, that kind of thing is a really big deal in cases. Like the crux of criminal cases oftentimes is what evidence gets suppressed. Like because you can, argue to suppress evidence based on all different kinds of things. And that's often, a piece of evidence gets in or stays out can really destroy someone's argument or really help the other person's argument. So I really appreciated that, they made that a big focus because that is such a real part of trials. Um, and obviously there was a lot of dramatic things, a lot of like when they just decide to on the whim, or he just decides to in the courtroom allow him to introduce the evidence, and everyone's kind of shocked. That's all not going to actually happen in real life. It's going to be way less dramatic and entertaining. But the, the thing I've always said about these films is you really have to make it not like the courtroom for it to be entertaining. And I think they did a really good job of that.
yeah, and you brought up, I guess, the entertainment factor of this film, or the most interesting premise is you are kept kind of in the dark as to the factual matters of the case, and you do there's an air of the defense, or no, the prosecution rather, kind of trying to convince you as a viewer as to the promiscuity of the wife, and the film even does that outside of the trial itself. And you brought up like the most interesting point, which is, was it an assault or was it consensual? And obviously you think you have it figured out because she's beaten, but then they kind of explore the avenue that Gazara had physically assaulted her in the past, and that maybe she was, or he was, the one who did that to her. It presented a very interesting case that was kind of mysterious to the viewer, and I think that was the portion of that made the film for me specifically.
Yeah, I think, it did a really great job of, showing this one particular thing that people call often in like the legal practice, like the gray area, where that's like the area of the case that you're supposed to really focus on because that's where your argument is like centered on. And what that means is it's having evidence, like the fact that there's evidence, and this is evidence, outside the trial because we're watching a movie and you see more than just the trial in the movie. But you see things like, she's flirting with James Stewart's character, and she just seems to be, a very flirty, promiscuous type person, possibly like from what the movie shows us. So that makes you think, okay, maybe she did do it. So there's evidence in your head that's saying, you, that she's lying about this. And then, you take that combined with kind of Ben Gazzara's general character, where he, seems mean spirited. There's evidence that he's been violent towards people in the past, and that he, there's this kind of gut feeling you get that leads you to believe he would kill someone like this, maybe whether or not she actually was raped, because you think that it kind of branches off into this other area where you're like, did she lie to him about it and then he hit her and then he just went and killed him anyways? Or did she tell the truth and then he hit her and then he killed him anyways? It's kind of like, you're not really sure. So this is all like kind of the gray area I'm talking about, where it's going back and forth in your head. And then, what Jimmy Stewart's strategy is just to say, okay, well, we know that he killed him, but we need to figure out this gray area to try and figure out if he was ignited into what he'd call a crime of passion. And crime of passion, in my opinion, is such like I'll use the word gray area again. It's so hard to put a concrete, like, oh yes, for sure that was a crime of passion, or for sure that was not. And unless it's just like you literally have video evidence watching someone get super irritated and then exploding into a fit of rage, which you're really not going to get that kind of evidence most of the time.
I think to your point about the crime of passion, what makes this so effective is that anytime, I guess, like growing up, like in my teenage years, when you hear about that as a legal precedent, the crime of passion, this scenario is a husband finds her wife in bed with another man, and it's almost like, to your point, when you don't have the physical evidence to prove it, it almost becomes like a test of reasonableness. Like, would this scenario reasonably be enough to set off said actor? And I think that's how they kind of laid that in motion, because I think, if you put yourselves in the shoes of Ben Gazzara's character, there is something to be said that, yeah, you can understand the fact that that could send you into a hysteric state or a violent state.
Yep, that's the exact standard. It's used across the legal field in all different types of areas of law, but most especially criminal law is they'll say, okay, now from the perspective, they'll ask the jury, would you think this is reasonable for an ordinary, let's say an ordinary and prudent person? Like, you're supposed to envision like a average person in society and say, picture them if, you found out this guy raped your wife. Would that would that reasonably, just like you said, lead you to killing them? And, and if I were a jury member, I would think, that's not a reasonable thing to do. But there's all types of people that could be in the jury, and all you really need is one person to say, that I could think that's reasonable in order to get their vote.
Exactly. Um, and I think the big reveal with this film, like the reveal from the daughter not only being the daughter of the man murdered, but that they found the underwear of the woman who was raped. Um, that became, I think, was that a reveal on our behalf as well as the viewer?
Yes.
I thought that was like the most kind of, there was so much very very well done elements, but that was maybe the most powerful moment of the whole film for me.
Yeah, it was a very dramatic reveal when that happened, and that was kind of the what did it for me, where you're just like, you don't really know what to think. And then, the way it ends, I think, is also a pretty interesting point.
Go ahead and kind of explain the ending and the elements that you enjoyed most.
Well, I just thought, because justice isn't really served, I feel like, because, yeah, they say he's not guilty due to this, which, I think that's kind of a crazy verdict. But, you know, and then he just kind of gets up and kind of leaves town. And you're just like, well, he that's kind of what I would predicted to have happened. Even though he got him off, it's kind of like there's no, well, like for Jimmy Stewart's character, there's no real happy ending. Even though he won the trial, it doesn't really feel like he won. But then at the very end, you realize, he's gonna kind of get it back, or somehow make it right by helping his daughter, the guy that was murdered's daughter, and I believe her estate, the estate management of the guy who died.
Okay, I see. I I might have misinterpreted the ending or caught it incorrectly. I thought at the ending he was going to go after the estate on behalf of the wife because he thought like justice wasn't done and that the man who was murdered should also posthumously stand trial for the sexual assault. So he's now working with the daughter to go after the man for the liability of the death, for wrongful death.
Uh, Honestly, I'm not sure. I think it could have been wrongful death. All I remember is that he's taking the daughter's side and he's doing something with her estate. So he's either trying to like get her funds, or he might be, or like manage her funds, or he might be trying to go after uh the mayor, Bengazara's character, for wrongful death.
Okay, so that was just a brain fart on my end, but because I can see where you're coming from. I think there's a lot of emotion involved anytime a sexual assault is mentioned, to where it didn't immediately strike me as like a grave injustice, but the way you broke it down as we were discussing this film, I can see your point of view, and especially with the details that are gone over in the film, where he had time to kind of let the information sink in, and it wasn't an immediate action taken on his place. That I can see where you're coming from, when you do where you think it is an injustice, and why Stewart's character would be wanting to, for lack of a better term, redeem himself.
Yeah, I think my point of view is not exactly maybe what the movie was intending, because I think maybe as a viewer you're supposed to think it was okay that he went and murdered him. But I just, in my gut, I feel like like Bengazara's character was in the wrong. Um, whether his wife was raped or not. I feel like that is not the proper reaction. I'm sure you obviously agree that you shouldn't murder someone, but yeah, because I think that justice isn't, like, it's showing that the justice system here, like, it did function correctly. It they each got their best defense, and nothing was really wrong in on that end. But I think that what it showed me, at least, was how his defense, uh he wasn't, I don't even think he was super confident that he was correct, but he still had to do that job, and it just happened to work.
And looking at it through that lens, I think that's something that the film tries to explore in the beginning third as well, because Stewart, he doesn't want to like coach up Gazara, but he basically tells him, look, you're like in between a rock and a hard place. You really don't have too many defenses, and I don't even really want to take this unless you kind of come to a reasonable explanation yourself without me straight up telling you. Although he does really guide him towards that direction, but it's still like something in his, it's a barrier that he has in his own mind, which is a way of the film kind of illuminating what you said, which is kind of the moral standpoint of the case as a whole.
Right, yeah.
Let me ask you, Matt, is there any additional elements of this film that you want to explore?
Um, hmm. No, I'm not really sure. I can't really think of anything. What about you?
I I do, I already mentioned it, but I do think I just I want to shout out again. I thought George C. Scott was really good, and that was kind of a unique element that he was kind of brought in. Can you explain to the viewers kind of what was going on there and why George C. Scott was brought in, and if this happens ever really in real life?
Um, if I remember correctly, was he the like they said he was from the Attorney General's office?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm not incredibly familiar with how that works, but I've seen, in certain cases, they will bring on certain attorneys that are very experienced in a certain practice. So, from what I got, this guy, George C. Scott's character, was an experienced trust, maybe specifically a trial attorney from the attorney general's office, meaning he kind of specialized in going to trial or maybe specialized in this type of work. And so, why he has a specialization is because most attorneys that do litigation, which is like lawsuits and also criminal cases, are like don't go to trial. They in the criminal world they take a plea deal, or in the civil world they'll settle. And so that's like literally 99% of your cases are going to happen with a settlement or a plea deal. And so since there are so few cases that actually go to trial, and I would say more go to trial in the criminal world, but because there's so few, there are certain attorneys that are like they will handle cases they know are going to trial, or they'll be called in for trials to come assist. And that's just kind of like an extra. It's kind of like, in sports, if you were to bring, a Hall of Famer onto your team for a game or something like that. Like it's just to try and boost your chances.
That makes sense. Does that happen frequently in common day or modern day? I meant to say.
Um, I'm not sure, but probably. Like I think of, OJ's case, when he had all that money to hire attorneys, they like brought together some of the best defense attorneys in the whole country, plus like renowned professors at some of the best universities to do this defense and to work together. And that's an example of how money, how when they say, you have a lot of money, you're going to get off, and it's because those best of the best trial attorneys or defense attorneys or whatever their practice might be are going to cost just extraordinarily more money than a regular attorney, because it's usually because they have, and this is something interesting that I kind of discovered last year, but it's more so that they have the resources. And just like a brief explanation of this, it's like the way the legal system works is you're filing a lot of like legal papers, like what we call motions, or so I'll try and give an example to explain it. So like in a case, in a criminal case like this, if the defense team has a good enough set of attorneys, then they're going to have the manpower to be able to file a ton of motions to try and suppress evidence. And the problem is that since the prosecution is the government, they don't have the money to drag this court case out for years and years. So what they're going to want to end up doing is taking a plea deal, which is like a settlement, to say, hey, okay, we're going to give you the defendant, like, let's say he in a trial, if he was found guilty, he would have gone to jail for 50 years. Well, they'll say, okay, if you plead guilty, we'll give you like 15 years instead of the 50 you would be found. And then they might take it. But if the defense team is really good, then the prosecution's going to know, we're going to have to either maybe just give him probation or something. And that's how people end up getting off, because they know that if the defense team has enough manpower, meaning that they're going to have the funds to be able to take the time to like file all these motions and basically be involved in the case, because being involved in the case as a lawyer, you're billing per hour, so it costs a ton of money. So it's like it kind of becomes a battle of how much time can you spend on this case. And if you're paying your defense attorneys a lot of money, they're going to be able to spend a lot of time that the prosecution, the government, just can't, because they have a million other cases they're worried about. Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. Um, Matt, let me ask you, what did you rate this film? And I guess any additional thoughts you want to say about the movie as a whole.
I also gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. I would say this one is it's very different to me than Judgment and Nuremberg. A movie like Judgment and Nuremberg, in my head, is much more about kind of like the Holocaust and World War II, and I kind of classify it with like this other really long movie that I would recommend called Showa. It's like 10 hours though, but it's very very depressing, and that's like I'd say you'll learn more about the Holocaust in that film than almost anything else you can do, maybe even visiting there. But this movie to me is more similar to the other legal films we discussed in the past, where you're really getting to see a good look at like what a legal procedure is kind of like. And it's always going to be distorted because everything happens really fast in the movie, and it's much more dramatic than real life. But I think maybe out of all the legal movies we've watched so far, I would say Anatomy of a Murder might be the best display of an actual how an actual trial is. As I said, a little more dramatic, but I wasn't like really getting upset like in some of the other ones, like, oh, they would never do this. That wasn't ever really happening. So I think this is a great legal movie. This would be in the three, like my top three I would recommend to people for sure. So I would definitely give it a shot, if you are interested in this kind of thing.
Absolutely, I gave this a 4.5 as well. So like on my all time favorite list, it's three legal dramas back to back to back, and I gave 12 Angry Men the nod as the top one, just because I do think it is really iconic for what it does. And then I give Judgment at Nuremberg the nod over Anatomy of a Murder, but I give Anatomy of a Murder, it's right there as well. I think they're all really, really good, and it's obviously one of my top three legal dramas. So this was a really fun episode, and it's always interesting to get your perspective on it, Matt, just because of the background that you have. So getting to bounce some of the questions off of it when it comes to the specific details, but also like the overarching morality of it's really interesting. So I appreciate you coming on today. This was awesome.
Yeah, I agree. Of course, I love discussing, legal topics, especially criminal law, even though that's not really what I want to do. Maybe one day I will. So, it's always been a passion of mine since I was, like 11. So I love coming on here and being able to talk about it. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we will catch you on the flippity floop. Bye, y'all.